Hi, this is Graham Allen, and this is going to be part 7 of a series on Carl Palmer's drumming and his contribution to progressive rock and rock drumming. It's taken quite a while for me to get round to this final episode for various reasons, but it's quite a tricky period to cover in a way because the work changed a lot from Carl's signature style, which was very busy, fiery, often based around a lot of top kit playing, and by that I mean focusing on the snare and tom-toms in his drum kits, which were often large, expansive. And one of the changes which I'm going to come on to is Carl cutting back on his top kit playing to a stripped back style, and also more focus on twin bass drums, which was quite a shift for him from the very orchestrated upper kit playing. I'll explain a little bit more about that. So I'm going to try and do this chronologically. There is an album that I don't have, which he plays on. There's very little session work with Carl Palmer, as people will know. So the last video, we ended up looking at the live albums, which actually ended with the release of Emerson, Lake and Palmer Live, which is a lot of the cuts from the Montreal Olympic Stadium and Wheeling concerts from the 77-78 tour. So Carl's playing is very much as it was, fast and top kit dominated. Obviously a great and fast single bass drum player, but no sign of double bass drums, which is going to change. So ELP split really in sort of 79-80. They didn't really split from each other, they just didn't work together. And Carl was the first to come out with this album, which is 1 PM and doesn't get a lot of love really from fans. And I think one of the reasons for that, I include myself, I thought Carl would come out with a fairly jazz fusion orientated project. I really liked his work on Works 1 and Works 2 that he'd done with the members of Backdoor. Bullfrog, Close But Not Touching were great tracks, and I thought that this project might be something a bit similar, but it wasn't. This is a rock stroke new wave sound to it, and his drumming is really on point, but it's not busy. So a lot of the fills around the toms and the very fast snare work is very limited on this album. This is a songs orientated album. There's no instrumentals on it. There are a few instrumental passages, and I think his playing is excellent on this, but it's very, very stripped back. And I think a bit of a surprise to people that around this time he was coming out with a very song dominated band. He was trying to change direction really, as he's often said in interviews, and as he often says very honestly, it just didn't work at all. People just didn't really go for this album. There he is. Just a little bit of drum history on this. He's now switched to a wooden Gretsch kit, which actually sounds very good on this album. He's got multiple tom-toms. He's not got the 7 top 2 floor tom configuration. He's changed it to 4 sort of hanging toms, 2 floor toms, and 2 bass drums. So that's quite a change in configuration for him, and the sound of the kit is different. It's a wooden Gretsch, but it's really good. So in terms of his playing on this, I think it's stripped back, but it's really good. It's got a good groove to it. There's some slightly unusual sort of meters that he plays on this at times, and I think it's worthwhile having just as part of his discography. Okay, so that's 1980. He then, as people will know, became part of Asia, and the first album here, which most people will know very well, I think he's playing on this, is excellent. He's switched to a custom-built Premier stainless steel kit with the same configuration as the Gretsch kit that I was mentioning. It's a great mixture here of groove-orientated, fairly steady, not too demonstrative playing, but there are some prog touches in here, and the kit is superbly recorded by Mike Stone, and there are some more kind of expansive tracks on here compared with PM. So people will know Wildest Dreams with the drum break on that. That drum break I'm going to mention because I think in a way, I mean, people will recognize the drum break from part of his solo, really. Use of the toms and the snare, a kind of interplay between toms and snare. And in fact, when he did further drum breaks, which I'll mention, he tended to repeat that sort of pretty similar tom snare interplay. Didn't vary it much. So people reviewing the albums might say something like, you know, Carl takes a short solo, but I did notice that it tended to be a very similar structure to the way the break on here on Wildest Dreams. I think he's playing on Heat of the Moment is great, slightly unusual time signature, characteristic drum part, or became a characteristic drum part for Carl, with kind of focus on the hi-hat and the bass drum, and the snare really just accenting main beats rather than a kind of groove building up. So that's the first Asia album. Then he plays on Alpha, which I've left up here by mistake. And I've just realised it's on my wall. It's sitting on my wall at the moment, so I can't get that down. The Alpha album is the second Asia album, and it's really significant because, in terms of Carl's history, because I think this was really stripped back playing for him. There was really no moments on the Alpha album, perhaps with the exception of Midnight Sun, which is in a slightly unusual time signature. I think it's 7/4. But basically the drums are low in the mix, much lower than on the first album, and there's nothing really particularly busy or fiery or distinctive about his playing on the Alpha album. I think a lot of people were quite shocked actually how much he was kind of in the background, and all his kind of distinctive trademark fills and runs were pretty much gone. So it was a little bit of a shock, I think, to a lot of people. Then we had the Astra album. This, of course, was without Steve Howe. Mandy Mayer comes in on guitar. I think a little bit more adventurous than Alpha. Quite a nice sound on this. The bass drum sounds strong on this. He locks quite well with John Wetton's bass on this. But again, there's nothing particularly flashy or hyperkinetic on this album. He uses some Simmons drums on this, just on the Rock and Roll Dream album, to more emphasize existing drum sounds. He's now switched to a Yamaha 8000 kit, which has got a slightly different sound. The snare is quite sort of orchestral and deep sounding, but there's not really many tom runs or anything particularly adventurous on this. So this was 1984, and this is the Astra album. So you can see a kind of a bit of a trend here now, that going from the end of ELP in the 70s, Carlos stripped back his playing considerably, and there's less busy snare work, and it seems to be going in one direction, which is kind of stripping back more and more. Now, just a couple of sessions to note here, because Carl has done very few sessions, certainly since Emerson, Lake and Palmer and his fame in Emerson, Lake and Palmer. And I don't really think of him as a session player because I think he's very distinctive in his busyness, like if you like, with his playing. And I think one of the things, and of course people have commented a lot on this, is that session players often have to be very, very considered in their sort of sitting in the pocket of whatever the song is. That tends to be their role, kind of very groove orientated playing. And I'd argue that's not really Carl's forte, as he kind of joked at times, if you want sort of metronomic time, get a drum machine, don't come to me. But worth a note is a session he did with Roger Daltrey on a tribute track to Keith Moon called Under a Raging Moon. It's a terrific track. And basically there are sequenced some drum breaks by a number of drummers. I'm just going to read them out. It starts off Martin Chambers from the Pretenders, Roger Taylor from Queen, Cozy Powell, Stuart Copeland, Zach Starkey, and then Carl and Mark Brzezicki at the end. Carl, again, going back to my point earlier, does a very fast but quite sort of standardized snare tom and a little bit of cowbell thrown in drum break on here, which is great to have, but it's not particularly different from anything else that he was doing at that time. But it's nice to have that. So that's Roger Daltrey, Under a Raging Moon. I think the album is called Under a Raging Moon. And it's, I think, 1986. 1982, and I haven't got the album, so I can't show it, is Carl did a track with Mike Oldfield, which is actually on his anthology, and it's called Mount Teide, Teide, and represents probably where he was living at the time in the Bahamas, a sort of kind of combination of that and Mike Oldfield. So it's a fairly basic track, and Carl just does really some orchestral snare and some accented tom-tom work. There's not really any sort of drum kit playing on it, but it's nice. It's orchestral in flavour. So what then happens is Asia splits up because of fairly well documented problems, falls in album sales, that kind of stuff. And Carl, in the last album, is using, as I said, the Yamaha 7000, 8000 drum kits. Not as distinctive sounding as the Premier steel kit that he was using on the first Asia album, an Alpha, and certainly not as distinctive as the drum kits and the stainless steel kit he used at the end of the 70s with ELP. So what does he do next? He sort of tries to reform ELP in a way, but people will know Emerson, Lake and Powell was released in 86. Carl gets together with Keith Emerson in 1987 and Robert Berry and produces this album, which I really like. It's sort of a mixture of prog, kind of power pop and rock. Has an American sound to it. It's got some really good standout tracks on here. There is a track called Destra La Vida where Carl stretches out for a little drum cadenza. Again, very similar, I think, to the Wildest Dreams drum break and the one on the Roger Daltrey 12-inch single there, or on the single. Slightly kind of repeating sort of snare, tom accents, but well played. And there is also some quite interesting rhythms on this. He was using a Dynacord electronic enhancement to his Remo kit. He'd now switched to Remo drums, 2 bass drums, 2 top tom-toms, sometimes 3, and 2 floor toms. The kit he was using, it was an Acousticon Remo kit, which is a sort of plastic synthetic type shell. I think not best for his playing really. There's not really any double bass drum stretching out on here. It's mainly single bass drum work, but he always used the double bass drums now in concert in particular, and played some great stuff, some great concerts from 3. So again, I think he's gone in a direction of mixing in some electronics with acoustic sounds. I think he was triggering or blending the Dynacord electronic sounds with the acoustic quite a lot. And in fact, I think Robert Berry has told me that a lot of this album is mainly electronic triggered sounds, the Dynacord kit. So well worth having that for, again, to sort of document his playing. So then we threefolds and we go back to Emerson, Lake and Palmer, who come back with the Black Moon album and then In the Hot Seat. And I think Carl does some really interesting stuff, particularly on Black Moon. He stripped back his playing. It's much more basic than 70s ELP. And again, he's triggering some electronic sounds with the kit, which I personally think takes away a little bit from his playing, that kind of acoustic, fast sound. His drumming is a little bit sort of more clunky, more heavy. The Black Moon track itself, people say it reminds them of Queen, We Will Rock You, that kind of groove, which is, Carl hadn't really done anything like that before. He stretches out a little bit on Changing States, slightly odd time signature stuff, and there's a couple of sort of slightly embellished drum fills on side 2 of the album, Burning Bridges. In the Hot Seat, kicks off with a great track, Hand of Truth, which I think people got very excited about, thought the whole album was going to be similar to that, and then were quite disappointed. I think there's some programmed drums on in the Hot Seats. He plays a halftime shuffle on one of the tracks, but it sounds as though it might be certainly part programmed. It might be a drum machine. It's difficult to know. And of course, people thought it was sacrilege, really, having what sounds like programmed drums on an album in Emerson, Lake and Palmer's name, but particularly having a drummer like Carl Palmer with sequenced drums. So that was the final Emerson, Lake and Palmer album, 1994. Aisha then, I'm just going to have a swig of tea, pardon me. Aisha then reformed in 2006, 2007, started off playing some live dates. It was great to see Carl playing live with Aisha, and they released a number of albums before Steve Howell left, and they did the last album, which was Gravitas. I'm not actually going to go through Carl's playing on all those albums because it's very stripped back. It's very just based on the song. Apart from the first album, which was the comeback album, which was Phoenix, where I think he's playing. It's got his personality. Again, there's a drum break during the track called, just find it on here, I've forgotten what it's called. Parallel Worlds has a sort of drum cadenza in it where he stretches out, but again, it reminds me of the Roger Daltrey drum break, the Wildest Dreams drum break, and the Destined La Vida 3 drum break. But otherwise, there's a nice little Bonham-esque groove on a track called Orchard of Mines, which is actually one of my favourite tracks on this album, and is a rarity because it's not written by Aisha. Beautiful track, and he plays a kind of a Bonham-style groove when the levee breaks type groove, and he plays it really well. Otherwise, there's some just good driving drums. So this is good to have. The later albums, again, it's a bit stripped back his playing. He was using double bass drums, and there is some quite nice double bass drum stuff. He's got fast feet, so he can kind of inject sometimes very fast triplets. on the bass drums. Never Again is a great track that kicks off this album. It's just got good sort of power rock drumming in it. But again, I think what he's done is moved to more emphasis on the bass drum sound and the snare, with not much fast playing on the snare and not really much tom work now anymore. The toms, the configuration is 2 top toms, and so they don't have the higher pitch toms, which I think picks up his playing a lot. The single strokes round the top toms with the higher pitches works really well with his style of playing. And I think the configuration of 4, 2 top toms, 2 floor toms, it kind of just blends in for that lower tom sound, not as high pitched, not as distinctive in the single stroke playing than was done earlier. So that is basically where we are. I want to keep this sort of reasonably short. And of course, he's played, what I haven't covered is he's played with the Carl Palmer Legacy, his trio, Carl Palmer Band, ELP Legacy stuff, released a number of live CDs, but nothing studio-wise, which I think would be quite interesting. I'd say about the ELP Legacy, and obviously he wanted to be very distinctive from sort of ELP with a keyboard sound by using a kind of harder edge guitar sound with bass, often quite busy bass stuff. Chapman stick is involved now. And the only thing I'd say about that, in a way, I think his drum style at its peak works really well with keyboards, because the keyboards give a fatter, wider sound than a busy guitar. And in a funny way, I think the busy guitar with the busy drumming, just sometimes you can't quite hear what's going on. And I always think he was perfect with Keith Emerson and with Vincent Crane as well. I think he's a drummer who just works perfectly with a keyboard player. That's not to say he doesn't work really well with Steve Howe and Asia, but I think the very busy elements sometimes means that some of his drumming gets a bit lost in the playing. So please add any comments. I've had some great comments from people all over the world about this series on Carl. And just to end up, I'll say I saw him in London in April, just over a month ago. And I'd seen some videos on YouTube, and I think a little bit, I felt a little bit reserved about seeing him. It was a small venue, and it reminded me afterwards what he brings. And there's an excitement, there's an edge to his playing. He was very, very fiery, very loud, and he kind of pulls it off. I mean, he's 72 now, and he's definitely slowed down a bit, but there is something about that edge to his playing. I always think of a train kind of going at full speed and sort of rattling on the tracks as though it might just come off. Sometimes when he's kind of pushing the meter of the playing in things like Tarkus and even Fanfare for the Common Man, it's that edge, that pushing it on, which of course he's mentioned when he did his rock school little tutorial, and he talked about the drummer, the edge, pushing it on, pushing on the band sort of thing. And that's his style. So he hadn't lost any of that. And I think, I was sort of monitoring people's reactions around me. And I think he just captures that some way, in a way that other drummers don't. And that excitement at the end of the evening is there from his playing. And of course, other people say, his groove isn't tight and all the rest of it. But I don't think you go and see him for that. I think it's this motoring, pushing on edge, which is his kind of legacy in a way. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that, and there may be another video in here, something a bit different. But anyway, hope everyone stays well, and see you soon. Bye-bye.